Have you ever noticed this strange little contradiction in your own life? You're online every day. You scroll, you watch stories, you read comments. You know exactly who broke up with who's suddenly into Pilates, who just moved to a new city, and who's pretending they're fine, but very clearly not. You're active, very active, and yet you never post. No photos, no opinions, no just checking in, nothing. If someone looked at your profile, they might assume you barely exist online at all, but your screen time says otherwise. And if you're hearing this and thinking, wow, that's uncomfortably accurate, then stay with me. Because the common assumption is that people who don't post are shy, insecure, or antisocial, that they're afraid of attention, or that they just don't have anything interesting to say. But the psychological reality is way more nuanced than that. In fact, many people who are active online but never post are some of the most observant, self-aware, and internally complex people on the internet. And once you understand what's really going on in your brain, this behavior starts to make a lot of sense. Let me paint a picture. Imagine walking into a party. You don't stand in the center of the room telling stories. You don't grab the microphone. Instead, you find a comfortable corner. You listen. You notice dynamics. You pick up on who's performing and who's being real. You enjoy being there, but you don't feel the need to announce yourself. Social media works the same way. Posting is like stepping into the spotlight. Lurking is like sitting back and watching the play unfold. And some brains are wired to learn, feel, and process before they express. One of the biggest psychological drivers here is something called self-monitoring. High self-monitors are people who are deeply aware of how they're perceived. Not in a shallow, I need validation way, but in a reflective, almost strategic way. Your brain is constantly running simulations. How will this sound? How might it be misunderstood? Will this still feel true to me in 6 months? When you're highly self-aware, posting doesn't feel casual. It feels permanent. Even a disappearing story feels oddly frozen in time, because once it's seen, it lives in other people's minds. So while others post impulsively, you pause, and that pause often turns into silence. There's also the emotional labor of posting that no one really talks about. When you post something, you're not just sharing content, you're opening a loop. You're inviting reactions, interpretations, judgments, and sometimes expectations. Will you reply to comments? Will you explain yourself if someone misunderstands? Will you feel weird if no one engages? For some people, that emotional overhead just isn't worth it. Your brain quietly asks, do I really want to manage this right now? And most of the time, the answer is no. Interestingly, research on personality traits often links this behavior to higher levels of introverted intuition or reflective cognition. This doesn't mean you're socially anxious or withdrawn. It means your inner world is already very full. You process experiences inwardly before externalizing them. By the time you've fully understood how you feel about something, the moment to post has passed. The emotion has already done its work inside you. There's also a deep authenticity filter at play. Many non-posters feel a subtle discomfort with the performative nature of social media. Even when posts are genuine, they're still curated, framed, cropped, timed. And if your brain values coherence between inner experience and outer expression, that gap can feel unsettling. You don't want to post something just because it looks good. You want it to feel true. And truth, as you've probably noticed, doesn't always fit neatly into a square photo with a caption. Think about how often you've typed out a post, stared at it, and then deleted the whole thing. Not because it was bad, but because it felt incomplete, like it didn't fully capture what you meant. That's not indecision, that's precision. Another layer here is memory and future-oriented thinking. Some people post to mark moments. Others store moments internally. Your brain might be thinking, this is for me, not for an audience. And that's a powerful distinction. Psychologists sometimes talk about internal versus external validation systems. If your sense of meaning comes more from reflection than reaction, you're less motivated to share your life in real time. You experience things fully first. Sometimes you never feel the need to translate them into content. There's also the social comparison angle. Being active online exposes you to an endless highlight reel of other people's lives. Over time, your brain gets very good at reading between the lines. You notice the exaggerations, the subtle competitions, the unspoken pressure to be interesting, productive, attractive, or unbothered. For some people, opting out of posting is a quiet form of self-protection. Not because they're intimidated, but because they don't want to participate in that comparison loop. And here's where it gets really interesting. Studies on observational learning show that humans can gain just as much information by watching as by doing. When you scroll without posting, you're still socially engaged. You're learning norms, you're tracking trends, you're understanding people. You're just doing it without adding noise. In a way, you're acting more like an anthropologist than a performer. You're studying the digital tribe. There's also something deeply philosophical here about identity. Posting asks a question, who am I right now? And it asks you to answer it publicly. For people whose identity feels fluid, evolving, or private, that question can feel intrusive. You might not want to define yourself in snapshots. You might not want to be pinned down by opinions you're still thinking through. Silence, in this case, isn't absence, it's openness. And let's talk about control. When you don't post, you maintain a certain narrative freedom. People can't easily categorize you. They can't scroll back and build a story about who you are. For some personalities, that ambiguity feels safe. It gives you room to change without explanation, to grow without announcing it, to exist without constant documentation. Ironically, many people who never post are deeply expressive in private. They'll send long voice notes, write paragraphs in messages, have rich, emotional conversations with people they trust. The expression is there, it's just selective. The audience is smaller. The exchange feels real. Your brain might also associate posting with exposure rather than connection, especially if you've ever been misunderstood online. The internet has a way of flattening nuance. Tone gets lost, context disappears. And if you're someone who thinks in layers, that can feel frustrating. You don't want to reduce complex thoughts into bite-sized content that can be skimmed and misread. There's a quiet confidence in knowing you don't need to announce your life for it to be valid, but there can also be a quiet doubt. Sometimes you wonder if you're missing out, if you should post more. If being invisible online means being invisible in general. And here's the reframe that matters. Visibility and presence are not the same thing. You can be present without being loud. You can be connected without being seen. You can be deeply engaged without performing engagement. In a world that constantly nudges you to share, choosing not to is still a choice. And it often comes from self-awareness, not fear. From discernment, not disinterest. From knowing that your inner life doesn't need constant witnesses to be real. So if you're someone who's active online but never posts, maybe there's nothing wrong with you at all. Maybe you're just someone who listens before they speak, who feels before they show, who understands that not every moment needs an audience to matter. And maybe the most important thing to remember is this: social media is just one language of expression. Silence is another. And for some minds, silence speaks volumes. If any part of this felt like it was describing you, take a moment to sit with that. You don't need to change your behavior to be valid, but understanding it gives you power. And if you ever do decide to post, it'll come from clarity, not pressure. And if you don't, that's okay too. You're still here. You're still connected. You're still very much part of the story. If this made you reflect, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments or just sit with them quietly. And if you enjoy exploring the psychology behind everyday behaviors like this, stick around. There's a lot more to unpack.